Hi, everybody. Welcome back. It's been a minute, in part because we have answered a lot of questions about work. And so now we really reserve doing these sessions when it feels like there's something fresh and worth it to talk about. And this is a subject we've talked about too little. For those of you who are here for the first time, I'm Roy. I'm a startup investor in the future of work. And some of our favorite guests to have to talk about dilemmas people have at work are founders who we've had the joy of backing. And so Brad Schneider from Nomad Data, we have had the joy of working with, and he'll tell you more about what Nomad does to help people get at data. So I'm not going to steal his thunder, but Brad, thank you for being here. And the question we have today is, I've just got a job that I'm trying to figure out how to use data to make decisions. I keep reading about the value of all this data, ... But like, okay, real talk, how do I do it?
Yeah. There's a lot to dissect there, and thanks, Roy, for having me on.
Of course.
And so I guess I'll start out with an anecdote. I guess two anecdotes from my previous job. So if I go way back to the very beginning of my career, I was selling. I guess you could barely call it software back then, but it in fact was software, and we were looking for clients. And it's always important to understand your clients before you get on the phone with them. And one of the first exercises I remember doing, which was somewhat eye-opening, was reading through a company's 10K, the information that they file once a year about their business. So I would do this for prospects that I was about to call because it was so rich in information about the companies I was about to call. In
Sure.
many cases, a one-page description in that document, I knew more about the company than sometimes the people that I was speaking to that worked there. And
Totally.
so that's a very loose example of data, but documents contain a lot of very rich data that can be applied to things. I then later was also an investor, not exactly like Roy. I was on the public side, and my job was to research things, was to research companies, was to research markets, to research commodities. And it was kind of funny because when I started that job, they handed me a set of books and they said, "This is how you invest." I believe the most recent book at the time was 25 years old. The older one, I believe, was 50 years old. And so it kind of points to not that much had really changed. And so I had just come from this world where I was building software, and we knew a lot about data. And I thought to myself, this doesn't seem like the best way to solve this problem. This at one time perhaps was, but in today's world, there are other ways to learn about things. There are armies of people that have already done the work on most of these things, who have created companies to
Sure.
track all the things that you're going to be focused on at work. And so if I leave you with nothing else, it's the data that you need is out there. You
Assume
just
it's
have
out
to
there. Having our
assume it's
X-Files
out there.
moment.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. And that's the core of sort of our business. That's sort of how we started out, was the realization that most people did not believe that the data they needed to do their job already existed. They
Occur to them
thought that
necessarily.
it didn't even occur to them. And the funny thing is we've been in this business of helping folks find data for about 4 years. And we are continuously surprised by what data is for
I
sale.
love that. I
And
would like to
so
hear
the
some of your
goal here,
surprising data that you would not have guessed exists, but exists.
I mean, it is deep. I mean, just to give you a little summary of what we do so any of this makes
Yeah.
sense, our core business, think of us like Google for data. We have about 3,000 data partners that sell all kinds of data, but we abstract that away from clients. They basically log in and they just describe the data they wish they had, and then they get connected with folks that have that data. And so a lot of people come to us thinking, oh, this data couldn't possibly exist, but in many cases it does. I mean, just in the last week, we've come across multiple data companies that track, the height of waves off the coast of California. There's an
Wow.
ecosystem of 15 companies that track cricket player statistics in India. There's a whole slew of people tracking the Swedish real estate market, and very, very nuanced pieces of that market. So again, the most important thing is just to stop and think, am I doing whatever work I'm doing the way it was done 5, 10, 50 years ago? Or am I embracing the fact that the world has changed? And in many cases, someone has done this work, and it's a lot cheaper for me to buy that work than it is for me to recreate it.
Sure. Okay. And so that, obviously I can work with a company like yours in order to do that. Once I assume I could buy it, and, I think one of the questions people have is like, how, it wouldn't even occur to me because I might assume it's also super expensive to access
Yeah.
some of this data. And so how do I think about things like, how much should I be willing to spend? Where, once I figure that it exists and where to get it, how do I assess its value to me?
Yeah, the easiest way is to try to imagine, well, how much time and effort and people would it take to recreate that data set? And then how vital is that data set to your business? And there's a
Sure.
lot of different ways you can use data. The most common ways, and one that we use often is just data on prospects, right? I need to sell to customers. I could literally go through LinkedIn one by one and try to figure out who works there and what do they do, but that is incredibly slow, and especially in an age of artificial intelligence.
Sure.
And just to give you some perspective, so we go out and we buy lots of data on people all over the world, on businesses all over the world, and then we actually apply AI to those. So I just explain to the AI, here's what I'm looking for: a company that does this, a person that does this, and I let it do the work of going through all of that stuff, and it basically allows me to do what would have taken 10 people a year to do. So would I have, if that technology didn't existed, would I have potentially made that investment in those people, in those resources to produce that? Is it that important? If it is, then you at least have a starting point to think about value. If it isn't, then probably you should switch to a problem that is more of a bottleneck to you and would basically bring more immediate value.
If I have Sometimes what happens is that the data's there. It's like on LinkedIn, or you use the example of a financial filing, but accessing it is pretty hard. Getting it into the format that I need. I mean, I give an example of that where we are hosting an event later this week, and that event had, I don't know, 100 people attending, and all we had was their names and their email addresses or something like that. But I want to know who those people are so I can figure out, like, I don't know, or some of them like starting a company and maybe we want to work with them, or some of them could be customers or just like, a person who works at a thing that I care about, whatever it is. And so, if a lot of times the challenge I think is that the data's, we know it's there in theory, but it's not easily accessible. What can you do in that kind of circumstance?
Well, that's sort of the beauty of the platform we built is you come in and you just explain the problem. So what you explained is generally referred to as people enrichment data. And that's part of
Meaning
the
like
problem
go
is
to
that,
nomaddata.com and do the people enrich and just explain that I'm having a people enrichment problem.
yeah, and here's what I need. And someone will respond and they'll give you the instructions. And so it's self-serve in the sense that you go to the site and you ask for what you need, but you get responses from real people that are there to sort of guide you because they know what problem it is that you have.
Sure.
And so, I think a lot of people think about data as being something that lives in a giant file or a database or an API. Data is information. And many of our providers, you just upload an Excel sheet or a CSV of those people, and they'll ship you back the enriched data. And they basically just giving you the answer. At the end of the day, people don't want giant databases. They have them because it gives them more flexibility to slice and dice in multiple different ways. But there's just as many people that don't want that, and they go to the company with the data and they say, you know what? Why don't you just give me the answer? Here's what I'm looking
Well,
for.
so let me ask you then, because you've now received a lot of these, just to help people with the imaginative act of just getting in the habit of imagining that the data is there. So now I've heard the generalization, which I think is true, that there's just an insanely wide around amount of data that you might not expect if I was analyzing wave heights in California or something like that. But what are some of the common situations where you feel like people ought to be considering accessing some data, but typically don't because they just don't think about it or don't know that it's there? Like it's sort of a greatest hits of some of these moments where we want people to pay attention.
Yeah, even when it comes to understanding your customers, most companies still think that if it's not in their database, it doesn't exist, right? If they came into my store, I can track them. If the customer left my store, I know nothing about them, which
Right.
couldn't be further from the truth. You really have to imagine the reality of the world we live in, where the internet is omnipresent, sensors are omnipresent, information is being collected continuously on you, on companies, on the economy, on everything. And so it's almost certain the data you're looking for exists. The question becomes, will someone sell that data? And I will say that there is just an avalanche of companies coming to market that are ready to start monetizing data, because data is not, people hear the word data and they think, oh my God, people are selling my information. Most of the data isn't your information. It's like a drop of water in the ocean. It becomes something else once it's aggregated with millions and millions and billions of other records into something that is fairly anonymous and fairly benign. Um, and so people shouldn't be so scared about approaching this market, because most of it is not in any sort of gray or black area. It's very much above board.
Yeah, I mean, the thing I just say there is I think there's two different ways of approach. One is approaching it as a buyer, where it's like, okay, do I feel like this data was collected ethically? And different people have different perspectives on that. I mean, you can now find an individual's location data without that much difficulty and basically de-anonymize them. So the buyer may have ethical concerns about that, which are a valid question. And then the other one is sort of, as I travel around doing my life, who is collecting data on me, where that I kind of feel like each individual should be able to decide for themselves what they are and aren't willing to do. It's not always easy because the companies can collect things in ways where it's like, oh, I hope it's been totally de-anonymized. But I guess what I don't want to do, I want to encourage people to use data without telling them, go do whatever you want on the internet. It'll be fine. You'll be safe. Because who knows? There are bad actors out there. And, we do live in a world where we are tracked, and that can produce some commercial value. And you have to decide as a buyer, sort of like, like one of the examples I think of is that the mail order catalog companies for years, maybe they still have it, but years when that was more of a thing, had a consortium where they would pool all the data they had about individuals. So if you bought from LL Bean, then I don't know, some other catalog seller, would know something about you. And people may not have necessarily been aware of that. And so I think it's to me, it's like a whole new world of being aware that a lot of this stuff exists and just going intentionally and carefully through it. And if you're looking at data where you're like, I don't feel like I should have this, that doesn't necessarily make it okay, but you should at least consider it and try to seek the data out for sure.
Totally. And there's all this fear about privacy and security, but I've been in this business in and around data for 15 years. And I can count on one hand the number of occasions where I've run across data that I thought, you shouldn't really be selling this. I mean, most people are going the other way, where they're being too careful. They're not bringing entire products to market that are above board because they're worried about just how it might sound to somebody else. And that's stifled the data market. All this legislation, all this fear of compliance and regulation. But again, most of the data vendors I've run across, maybe outside of the lead gen, these are very ethical firms, and they're not seeking to, pull a fast one on anybody.
For sure. And just before we wrap, any other thoughts on tactics people can use to try to get, any other tips and tricks for folks?
I mean, the other big thing, which is very new, is this idea of AI. And AI, I know, is this amorphous blob, but let's make it real. Let's make it ChatGPT. A lot of the information in a company is locked up in documents you've written. They're locked up in your CRM. And these AI systems, like a ChatGPT, or we even have an enterprise version of that for chatting across thousands of documents, it can really accelerate your work, right? If you can, like, for example, we have companies that they've been taking notes on industries and companies for a decade. And that is such a rich source of information, but it's locked up in notes in PDF files. Now they have the ability to just upload these files and just ask a question across them. And this functionality is showing up in more and more places. We're using it in Jira to remember how we built features on our own product. We're using it in our CRM to find, what was that meeting where they mentioned this or that or something kind of like that. That was unfindable before, unless you knew the exact keyword. But this type of generative AI, these things like ChatGPT and our enterprise tools are just making all of that past knowledge so accessible to basically build on. So that's very exciting. And if you haven't even played with some of the free tools out there, I highly recommend it.
Got it. Any other parting thoughts before we go?
Data's everywhere. It's useful. Let us help you find it, and just be open-minded to the fact that it can help you do your job a lot more efficiently.
Awesome. And if folks want to see one of the new products that I feel like you guys got, we've got something to check out there at docscanner.ai. and powered by Nomad, and pulling some of this out of documents and making it in a more usable form. If you want to see other past discussions we've had about various questions, and I think this might be one of the first ones we've ever done about the use of data at work. I have to go look and see what's similar. You can find past recordings we've done and some summaries of some of the more popular questions at thisisnotadvice.work. And we get our questions and our guests from what folks say to us, so feel free to reach out. And Brad, thank you for all the work you're doing to help people understand this, and to be continued.
Thanks, Roy.
Awesome.
Enjoyed the chat.